Welcome back to the Future Skills podcast. Today, my guest is Mike Gadd from YESSS Electrical. Mike heads up the EV and energy sector at YESSS Electrical, and we're getting him on the podcast today to talk everything EV, electrical wholesalers, and opportunities for electricians coming up. Hi Mike, welcome to the Universal Skills podcast.
Hello Dan, thanks for having us on.
No problem at all, it's great to have you on. So Mike, you head up the EV section at YESSS Electrical, and I think a good place to start the podcast is what got you into EV at YESSS Electrical?
It started a few years before YESSS actually. I previously worked in the fleet sector, and the business I was working at the time had several customers that I'd managed and was involved in the accounts with, who were doing preparatory studies about the changeover from petrol and diesel to electric and hybrid, which looking back sort of 4 or 5 years now was a very big step for the customers back then. And essentially, I got involved because I was helping customers understand their journey from a vehicle perspective, but didn't really have a ton of knowledge or much focus on the charging perspective. Started to branch out and get involved in that. And then through the contacts I made and some of the work that I've been doing, that job transitioned into me working for EO Charging for 1.5 years, looking after a number of areas, but with a main focus on the fleet side of selling.
All right.
And that was the start of the journey. So yeah, got involved through the fleet leasing side, realized that the plugs or the plug sockets, to put it in simple terms, that power the cars were probably a more important buying decision than the vehicles themselves. Here for 1.5 years, and then I moved across to YESSS in July of 2019, really to help them grow and expand the EV division and try and essentially do a bit more than any other wholesaler was in the sector at the time, by partnering not just the products, but also partnering with the full package, from training through to advice, through to help on the grants, consultancy, design. And that's really where we've evolved from, and we've got to the stage where we're at today.
Great. So July 2020 then, when you joined YESSS, so a bit of a crazy time then, because it'll have been just after the pandemic started?
2019 actually, yeah. So it was 2019, and but to be fair, it was a crazy time even in 2019. Not to the levels we're seeing now, but you may have seen this from the trading side. But the first sort of 8-9 months in the role for me were not really about selling. It was more about education and helping people understand the market, which was going really well. And then the pandemic happened, and the ability to get out and see people and carry that education on slowed down quite significantly. But fortunately, at the same time, the general market awareness around electric vehicle charging and around the renewables industry really picked up, which meant that despite the fact that we'd lost some of that face-to-face contact, the momentum of the market didn't really take too much of a hit. Yeah,
it's interesting you mentioned the education piece there, because I still find that in the training centre, that there's so many people who just don't understand that the train of EV is coming. It's on the track, and maybe some of the track's still being laid, but it is coming, and there's lots of opportunities out there for EV. What do you think the biggest opportunity at the moment is for sort of electricians? Because we get asked all the time for electricians, what benefit is this to the training? And of course, we'll show you how to install a charge point correctly, and we'll get you fully accredited. But what do you see as the big opportunity out there at the moment in EV?
I mean, personally, from the electricians that we work with and we deal with, I think there's a couple of facets to what the opportunity gives to an electrical company or an electrician working individually. The first one is just having that extra string to their bow, and I would liken it potentially to the early stages of the LED market, when people could see the benefits of transitioning to more efficient lighting. But you had several market factors against them at the time. So the cost of the actual product, the knowledge about what was needed, the change of infrastructure to go from older styles of lighting to LED. And I feel like we're in a very similar space. If you speak to any electrician, now sort of 15, 20 years on from that happening, they'll say the same thing, that LEDs just become an integral and core part of their business, in very much the same way that electric vehicle charging will. If you look at the number of vehicles, the number of properties, the number of businesses, anywhere where you can spot a car being parked up is pretty much an opportunity for an electric vehicle charger to go in. So it's a huge business segment. And it also, I think the other really exciting thing that we're seeing, and you may be seeing as well, as electricians transition into this market and become more comfortable with it, is we very much see EV chargers as a bit of a gateway drug to the renewables market. So people will get an electric car, they'll get an EV charger on their house. And all of a sudden, because you are solely responsible for the propulsion of your vehicle, you've got to make sure you plug the vehicle in. You've got to essentially, leading up to the installation, make sure your property's got the right amount of power, or your business has. Previously, for the last 120, 130 years, someone else is worried about that. Your local petrol station's job was to make sure that there was fuel in the pumps. You only had to pay for it and put it in your vehicle. So what we now see as well, the big excitement factor for us and the customers that we service, is EV is a starting point, and it's a big starting point, but it opens up conversations with the electricians and their customers about so many other areas, be that battery storage, be that solar panels, be that heat pumps. And it's really the start point of the whole renewable revolution, where within the next 10 to 15 years, it's going to be very commonplace for people to be powering their own houses from self-generated energy, or at least a degree of their power coming from that, and businesses as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because some of the feedback that we get from electricians is they'll go to a lot of homes to install a charge point, and perhaps somebody's just ordered a new electrical vehicle, and the consumer units have not been looked at for 20, 30 years as well. So there's additional work to the unit. It's not just a case of turning up and installing a charge point, is it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's the thing, is it's forcing a lot of people to take a look at it. I mean, if you look at the corporate or commercial, industrial electrical markets, board changes are done fairly regularly. People get inspections and certifications done annually, and you have to keep on top of that. I know myself, I drive an electric vehicle, and I had to go about getting my fuse cutout upgraded from 60 amp to 80 amp when I put the charger in my house. And, you're forced to essentially look under the stairs, in my case, or at the back of a cabinet at your board, and go, well, actually, this is a bit old and a bit creaky, and maybe I should get it upgraded. So yeah, there's a huge amount of ancillary works that go around it. And the other element is it's forcing people to look at the efficiency of their houses or their businesses, because if you take the standard example, most domestic properties will only have one charger, some may have two, and businesses are now going from looking at 1 or 2 charging points in their car park to maybe looking at 8, 10, 20. Now, that's all well and good, and it's a great thing to move the vehicles across to a highly efficient and highly clean form of fuel in the sense of electric. But at the same time, you're actually increasing your power draw drastically on the building. So the other element as well is we've now got to sit there and look at the whole energy piece of a building and say, well, actually, if we are putting a car charger on, that's great, we can do it, but you're going to need to increase the efficiency of your property in several other areas, or else you're going to start tipping yourself into the realms of supply upgrades, which, as many of us know in the industry, can be very costly and will be fewer and far between. The grid only has a finite amount of power, and they're not just going to keep saying yes to supply upgrades as they currently are.
No, I know it can cause issues as well if there's quite a lot of pre-work that's got to be done, isn't there, before the installation, and making sure they calculate the load correctly for the property, because depending on what's being used already in that property, it can cause big problems. We've heard already with a few properties that have ended up just tripping their electrics constantly from a charge point being fitted. So part of the training that we do is obviously that education piece. But have you found that much where customers are coming back and there's issues with things being overloaded?
So we did initially, I'd say in the early stages of the EV market, particularly. I mean, I'm talking even pre-YESSS days for myself, back when I was working with EO. It's been a huge element, and it's been a bit of an elephant in the room for a lot of installations. We're finding it's becoming less common now that load management technology is becoming more and more standardized across product ranges, and also the understanding of, like you say, through people like yourselves giving that level of training, and through, you know, we're very, very keen from all of our YESSS electrical branches and through all of the work that the EV division do within the business to make sure that customers are aware of this, and it's a conversation that they're having at the early stages rather than, you know, later down the line when something has tripped. Yeah,
no, absolutely, because it can cause chaos. I think, like you say, now it's not brand new, is it, EV? What would you say just on that? Actually, it's something I get asked quite a lot. And if we think, obviously, EV started, if you was to give it a percentage down the road, you know, 100% being completely finished in terms of everyone's got a charge point, how far do you think we are in?
3%, 4% maybe maximum. I'd say, certainly from the UK perspective, you know, you can look at, we often look at the markets in places like Norway, Sweden, Germany, Netherlands. You know, these are all markets that are far more mature than the UK market, but they're still very much in their early stages. And I think it's good because from the UK perspective, we can look at what countries, use Norway as the shining example of EV uptake and how EV charging should be done. If we look at what's happened in that country, these conversations about load management and about the, you know, protection of supplies in buildings, these were happening sort of 5-6 years ago. They were in the same position that we are today. And we don't have to go through the hard yards like they did. What we can actually do is take a holistic look, and we can cherry pick the best parts of what they learned, and we can cherry pick the best parts of what the German or the Dutch markets learned, and then we can take them and integrate them into our own solutions. And certainly, I think from a regulatory perspective, as well as also a product perspective, the UK market's one of the strongest in terms of charge point regulation. And it's also one of the most advanced in terms of product choice and product features. So we're in a good starting position, but we're very early stages still.
Yeah. Do you think, I know there's discussions at the moment in the industry, and my background being smart metering, a long time ago when smart metering started, energy companies sort of went on their own path, and when communications were involved, some picked Vodafone to help them communicate, some picked O2 to help them communicate, somebody picked somebody else. Can you see it getting to a stage where it's just got one regulator that says it has to go down one communications path like smart metering?
I think we're approaching that point very quickly. There's been several market trends that have emerged, and particularly have emerged within the last 12 months. So, for example, OCPP, or Open Charge Point Protocol, is essentially, for anyone who's not au fait with the term, the idea of OCPP and the Open Charge Point Protocol scheme is that you can essentially have any hardware on the ground, and you can change the back office and the communication protocols of that hardware just simply based on the back office that you hook it up to via generally a SIM connection, but it can be done in other ways. And we went for many, many years without customers really exploring the idea of open protocol systems. You look at the last 12 months, particularly in the commercial market, most of the bigger clients that we're working with, the software is the main part of what they're doing rather than the hardware. And that's also being fed from a regulatory perspective. If you look at some of the changes that were laid out in the latest round of decarbonisation plans, and some of the changes which are going to be coming around next year, where, you know, the communication and how chargers interconnect with the grid, with relevant sorts of regulatory bodies, and even with other chargers, is just as important as the physical safety features and how much power it will put into the car. So yeah, back at the market, there's been a lot of customers and areas where people have taken a charge point and then you're essentially fixed to that level of communication. What's going to happen moving forward is customers will have a huge array of choice, and just because you choose to buy a charger from brand A today, and if you then choose to install a charger from brand B in 6 months, that's not going to preclude them from talking to each other and working together. And the good thing with all of that is, to sort of finalize the point, the more communication we have with the chargers, the greater visibility we have from not only a grid perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective, to make sure that these chargers are doing what they say they are, and essentially ensuring that EV drivers are getting the service that they deserve from the charging points they've installed.
Yeah, it's going to be a big part of it, isn't it? Another thing that we get asked quite a lot, and one of the reasons why people come through the training with us, is initially when they get involved in EV, they're not aware of the government funding, the support that's available both domestically and commercially. Now that's coming to a bit of a change, isn't it, next year? Can you talk us through the changes there? What's actually happening next year?
So absolutely. So as far as we've been made aware by the government grant schemes and OZEV and the DVLA, the workplace charging scheme, as we know it, so the commercial grant funding is going to remain in place. So that's obviously your £350 per socket, up to 40 sockets across the total business. So you've got essentially that £14,000 of grant funding available. The biggest change is in the domestic market. So there's been, in one form or other, a domestic grant around for nearly a decade now. They initially started at a very high amount. There were days when these grants were sort of nearing £1,000 to get your charger installed, and the government grant scheme slowly wound that back to the point where we are today, which is the £350 for a charger to be installed in an off-road parking location. That grant comes to a close on the 31st of March next year. And there's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of speculation in the industry, a lot of concern, a lot of worry about what's going to happen, how's it going to operate. There's a number of people who are probably quite happy the grant's going to come to a close, because as they've foreseen it, it's been difficult in some cases to access the funding, and others are naturally concerned because removing £350 from the cost of a domestic installation could create a higher barrier to entry for a lot of drivers. But the positive change, as we see it, is from April next year, the grant's going to be modified. So the grant will essentially change into being focused on apartment buildings, houses of multiple occupancy, really trying to focus on people who don't have a driveway or a garage or an easily accessible parking space. And that grant funding will go towards management agents, landlords, large property owners, essentially installing the underlying infrastructure, so that if you do live in an apartment block and you are on the 6th floor and there's no way of getting power down to your parking space, you can access it from a more centralized location. And rather than paying huge amounts of cost to get power down to your parking space, essentially you're just paying for someone to come and connect up a charger to some ductwork with the cabling already there.
Right. So we don't expect anything sort of, a standard terrace house. They've got a driveway. We think that from April onwards next year, there's probably not going to be a grant there.
That's correct. Yeah. So that facet of the grant funding scheme is going to end now. There are a number of different ways in which both we from YESSS and the contractors that we work with are seeing that that's going to change and amend and modify. So that there's obviously different funding routes that are being explored at the moment as a route to sort of fill the gap that's being left by the grant scheme. And I think it's important as well that those conversations are happening, because all of the great things we talked about 5-10 minutes ago, load management, smart charging, they're all becoming the accepted standard, but they do all come with a cost. So there needs to be a balance that's struck really between that grant funding going and finding a way to make it accessible for consumers and drivers to get their chargers installed, because we don't want to see people just putting something in because it's cheap, when in fact that means that you can't load manage, you can't stop the property tripping out, you've not got visibility of your EV charger or the tariffs that it can work on. Yeah.
I mean, if you consider that where we are at the moment, then, so you think we're about 3% in, and I'd agree with you as well. It's very much at the start, and it's going to be an interesting. We've seen lots of bumps on the road in smart metering, and there's been mandates that have been put back once, twice, 3 times, and it's been extended and extended and extended. You can sort of see a similar journey and a skill shortage here in EV. What would your advice be, Mike, to somebody who's thinking, I'm an electrician, I'm quite busy in what I'm doing, heard about EV, never really got involved, don't know enough about it. What would your advice be to those electricians?
Don't be scared, essentially. Just have a conversation, whether it be with yourselves from a training perspective, whether it even be, swinging by a YESSS branch and speaking to us, or, and I'm not trying to make this into a sales pitch. There's plenty of people around the market that will be in a good position to give you advice on the charging market. But what I would certainly say is that it's nothing to be scared of. When you actually get down to the brass tacks of an EV installation, particularly a domestic one, and even some small commercials, there's nothing that's going to throw a huge spanner in the works from what standard electrical works will have already been done and what people are used to. I think the biggest fear, the biggest factor that's held people back is, like you said, there's been this sort of toing and froing from a regulatory point of view. There's been changes to the grant scheme, there's been changes to the IET regulations around earthing. And we had a very turbulent couple of years, that sort of 2017 to 2019 stretch where the regulations were still very open to interpretation. You had different voices around the market saying different things. And what it essentially did was it created this confusion that any electrician walking into it would rightly look and go, nah, not for me. But I think we're through the worst of that now, and we're getting to a point now where the accepted features, the accepted way of wiring, and the accepted sort of approach to putting a charger in have become fairly standardized. And that needs to happen for mass market adoption, because, as you say, people aren't going to get involved if the goalposts change every 5 minutes.
No, absolutely. Like I say, it seems to be in a much better place. I always remember when we started our EV journey, just as a training provider, we launched quite closely with yourself actually in April 2019. And there were lots of lessons for us to learn as well. We were quite fresh to it, really experienced in electrical and smart metering and gas. But EV was very new to us, and people had a lot of questions. And just for us, even with the sort of lockdown restrictions and the pandemic over the last sort of 2.5 years, we've learned a hell of a lot. And our delivery team as well now, they've become experts in it, because when you're training and you're giving that product knowledge, you will get asked those questions. And electricians, I always think, are really intelligent people, and they will ask you that one question that keeps you very much on your toes. So you've got to know what you're talking about.
You're absolutely right, and I have an ultimate amount of respect for electricians, because I've never known an industry read regulations in as much depth as electricians do.
No, me neither.
Which is interesting, because you get these questions, which, like you say, there's often some curveballs thrown at you, and it's like, right, never had that question before. But it's good because it forces myself, you guys at Universal Skills Group, it forces anyone in the market to constantly learn and constantly update their knowledge. And I've always been a big proponent. I don't like people using the term expert in this market, because somebody who's classified as an expert today, in 3 months' time, could know nothing, because the market's moved on that quickly. So it's every day's a school day in the market, to use the old adage. And I think that's the other element. It's having that knowledge to fuel the curiosity, rather than just ignoring the question or people being afraid to ask it. We would always welcome people to ask the difficult questions, ask the questions that are a bit left field, because it's those sort of answers and being able to confidently give those answers that will enable electricians to take that knowledge to their customers, confidently put their fears to rest as well, or any misconceptions to rest. And that is what's going to change it. It's not government can set policies and regulatory bodies can set hard and fast rules about it. But at the end of the day, it's like anything. It's based on people. It's a very human element of explaining to someone, right, you've used petrol and diesel for 30 or 40 years, now we're having to make a change. And it's holding people's hands as you go through that change and doing it in a way that respects, the fears and the questions they may have.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And I think, to sort of sum up with this, EV's at a stage now where it's about to boom. There's lots of opportunities. Funding is changing domestically, but there's still lots of funding available commercially. And we've reached a stage now in EV, like you just said, there's lots of support around, and there's good support out there as well. There's lots of videos as well on YouTube that I think are quite good caliber now, and there's been lots of lessons learned, so it's a good time to get involved. Mike, it's been great to have you on. I really appreciate you taking the time out. Thank you very much, and yes, speak to you soon.
Yeah, thank you for having us, Dan, and likewise, been good to speak. Thanks very much.
Big thanks to Mike for joining us today from YESSS Electrical. Hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you in the next one.